Hi, I'm Sylvia Bereknyei Merrell, and I'm a research scholar in the Department of Surgery and Aspire at Stanford.
I'm Janine Bruce, and I'm a research scholar in the Department of Pediatrics with the Pediatric Advocacy Program, and this is an introduction to qualitative methods.
Today we'll be talking about various ways to collect data in qualitative research, different threats to validity and how you can use that to your advantage, some sample size and sampling strategies, and then a brief introduction on some analytic approaches to qualitative data. So before we get started today, just as a reminder, quantitative and qualitative research methods have different origins and different assumptions in terms of the research approach and the philosophies, but each have valuable contributions to research, and the focus today here is specifically on qualitative research. So qualitative research really brings out the lived experience of a person, and it really focuses on the value of the human and the human interactions and experiences, the learning process about people, events, places, activities, how people and researchers can interpret this aspect of knowing about concepts and ideas in the social world. The value of qualitative research also is that the investigator can bring their own interpretations and understandings into the research process in a very systematic way. But overall, what we're trying to understand in qualitative research is this lived experience within the context of our research. Why use qualitative methods? Through a rigorous and qualitative approach, we can do a systematic collection of the data, do a systematic analysis of the data so the researcher can better understand either new or complex ideas, some solutions to problems that may have previously been not known, understand relationships or a confirmation of other findings, describe or uncover new exploratory models and processes that again may have been previously unknown. And then this one's really important. It's often a mechanism to provide a voice for participants who regularly may not have a voice as well.
So now we're going to talk about approaches to qualitative data collection. There are several different approaches that can be applied in qualitative methods. Two of the most common approaches are interviews and focus groups. Both of these provide a conversation that elicit participant perspectives. Interviews are one-on-one, in-depth conversations with a participant, while focus groups really are designed to stimulate interaction between different participants to generate data that gain firsthand insights. The purpose of both of these approaches is an open exchange, direct or indirect questioning, and allowing participants to provide their own experiences and opinions. So with focus groups and interviews, it's really important to decide which approach will best help you answer your research question. Reasons to use focus groups include when you want that group interaction, when you want the group participants to really stimulate responses among one another. Also, you can use focus groups when you are okay with getting less input from any one individual. Because during a focus group, multiple people will speak, but you may not have time to delve in depth with any one particular individual. Additionally, focus groups can be more feasible when you need or have the ability to assemble all of the participants in one location versus trying to track them all down individually. And also, finally, focus groups can offer quick turnaround time when you may have limited funds and resources. So some reasons to use in-depth interviews include when you feel like there might be some group pressure that could inhibit responses among your participants, when the subject matter may be too sensitive for a group discussion, or you feel that the topic really warrants greater depth of individual responses. Additionally, you may want to choose to do participant observations. These can be first-hand observations of activities in a small or large group. They often utilize structured observation instruments such as checklists or field notes. What observations allow you to do is gain different insight into someone's life and experiences, something that you can see rather than hear in terms of what is happening for the participant. You can understand behavior, social connections, and meanings within a particular context. Now, just because participant observations are a different strategy, don't forget that you can include and combine these strategies with some of the other strategies I've mentioned already, such as focus groups and interviews.
And another great benefit, Janine, for observations is that you can objectively identify what participants are actually doing and then use your strategy and compare with what they're telling you.
Exactly. And that will lead us to thinking about some ways to increase validity, which Sylvia will talk about later. Document analysis is another approach to collecting qualitative data. Depending on what your research question is, there may be many existing sources of primary or secondary data that could be very helpful to help you understand the particular phenomenon or issue that you're exploring. These different documents can provide additional insights that may not be observed or noted. The purpose would be to analyze what participants have already developed in the form that's important to them. Some examples of documents that might be relevant could be meeting minutes, or it could be documents or policies that are publicly available that add additional information to the topic that you're studying. Audiovisual materials are really a fun additional way to collect qualitative data. More and more people are using audiovisual materials and technologies to enhance their data collection. Oftentimes, it can be the researcher or the participant who's collecting the data. Participants can also collaborate in the research process as well. So the purpose would be to determine non-text-based themes and relationships, creative ways to engage participants in the research process, and really allow participants to share what's important to them. One opportunity to do this is through community activation, and the method here would be photo voice. Surveys also provide an opportunity to ask open-ended qualitative questions. You can add open-ended questions as part of a larger survey, or even have a few qualitative open-ended questions as standalone questions. But what you need to do is you really need to understand the ratings from the other survey sections. You want to make sure that these open-ended questions are really compatible with the larger survey in general. So are you delving deeper qualitatively into a couple of constructs that have been asked quantitatively, or are you exploring new constructs that really enhance the data that you're collecting quantitatively? So the overall purpose of survey open-ended questions would collect information for more people. It gives you the ability to ask questions in the same way, in a very structured manner. So you can apply some different approaches in terms of analysis. You can actually look at some frequency counts of categories, given that you've asked this in a very structured way. And then it can also really enhance how you're answering your research question. So some final key considerations for qualitative data collection is really thinking about what is the most appropriate methodology for your research questions and your study aim. What alternative methodology could be used instead? What are the most significant logistical considerations that you might experience with these different strategies? And what is feasible within your resources, time, skills, and access?
Thanks, Janine. Next, we'll talk about addressing threats to validity. Now we're thinking about addressing threats to validity. It's really important to consider that the reasons to do so is to really enhance the credibility of the process itself, everything that you went through from developing your research question to disseminating your findings, that you have confidence that you went through the process correctly and can defend each step along the way as something that you purposefully developed and added to your research study. So this can be done through different mechanisms, which are listed here. The first two actually, are some things that we use really commonly. The first one being triangulation, where we might use different data sources, such as interviewing 10 different people about their experiences, and to better understand the collective experience. We might have different data collection types. So we might have interviews and field observations to have congruence or confirmability about what the participants are experiencing in their world around them in the context. And we might have triangulation through data analysis, where we would have team members do the analysis together so that we can confirm that others around you can also come to the same conclusion. Another one that we use commonly is participant validation, where we might go through the process of data collection and data analysis, and go back to the participants themselves, either in interviews or focus groups or surveys, and say, these are our findings. Is this congruent to what you told us? Is this something that is resonating with you?
And this is really a common practice in community-engaged research because, as Sylvia mentioned earlier, one thing that you can do with qualitative research is bring voice to participants that don't always have a voice. And so in some of the community-engaged research that I do, we often want to take back what we found and make sure that this really reflects what the participants conveyed to us and want to convey to the larger community.
So the most important thing to consider when planning your qualitative research study is that you really want to build in these mechanisms of addressing threats to validity based on the research question that you have. So it should match, the mechanism itself should be matching how you're addressing the research question. Use multiple strategies. Don't use just one of those strategies. Even having multiple researchers on your staff or on your team is good for a check. And then finally is be transparent in your documentation of what you did to address threat stability, but also in how you describe it to others. These are one of the many reasons why qualitative research might be unfavorably reviewed in papers, and so it's really important to be able to succinctly describe what you did and why in addressing these threats to validity.
If I can make one last comment here, if you're feeling a little confused and not sure how to go about understanding these different approaches, one great strategy would be to look at some qualitative research studies that are already out there, see how those researchers have described what they've done from start to finish.
That's an excellent point, Janine. It's always good to go back into the literature, especially in the topics and journals that you're interested in publishing in, and ensure that you're meeting at least those minimum standards of what they're publishing at this time.
So now we're going to talk about sample size and sampling. Some things to consider when trying to determine your sample size is how appropriate the sample size should be for your research question and population. For example, if you're studying a phenomenon within a population that's particularly rare or vulnerable, you might not have the ability to have as large of a sample size as you may want or think that you need for publishing purposes. So what you have to do is really be flexible. So really think in terms of what is feasible and doable in your resources and your overall research question. Can a sample size be too large? Yes, absolutely. Can it be too small? Yes. When a sample size is too small, you have to be very careful in terms of the assertions that you make about your data and be very realistic with your findings.
I would like to also add, Janine, there are instances when you can have an N of 1 as your sample size. For example, a case study is an N of 1, although you might have multiple interviews from different people or multiple observations or interviews over time from somebody. So it just needs to match your research question.
And that's a really good example. So some things that you can do is base your sample size on similar studies, similar populations, similar research questions, and also the journals that you're aiming to publish your work. So allow for resource and participant constraints. Think about thematic saturation. As you're collecting data, you'll often want to collect data until you reach saturation. That could be a larger sample size than what you expected, or it could be smaller. And then additionally, you may want to consider collecting data until you no longer hear new information. And that's really the point at which you reach saturation. The ultimate goal is to maximize your understanding of the population and the phenomena you're studying. To attain an ideal sample size, it really must not interfere with understanding the overall case at hand. So in summary, there's no ideal sample size calculation for qualitative methods. The literature suggests a sample size of at least 12 for interviews within a homogeneous group for simple constructs to reach thematic saturation. So an N between 15 and 20 might be more suited for complex or nuanced cases.
Or more. So we do have situations where if you're doing 4 groups, you might need to consider 15 to 20 per group. Is that right, Janine?
Absolutely. So it all goes back to what is the question that you're actually answering. So in terms of thinking of your sampling strategies, in qualitative research, we often use purposeful sampling. What does that mean? It means sampling within a population of individuals, thinking about events or processes or documents. And within that, the sample size, you might consider the number of interviews, the number of observations that you might need, and the number of documents that would enhance your overall study findings. So a typical case could be an interview of 20 people all at one time. Or an extreme case could be an observation of one person over 10 times. So within purposeful sampling, you might want to think about some different strategies. Some people might think of maximum variation, where you're really trying to get variability across all of your responses. Others might be interested in studying a more homogeneous population, and so they would want to have multiple people that all fit specific criteria. Sometimes, at least in medicine, people are looking for a typical case. What is normal? What is abnormal? And that would be a deviant purposeful sampling. Snowball sampling is a different type of sampling where you have identified a few key individuals who are very knowledgeable in the topic that you're exploring. And so after you conduct your interview or focus group with these individuals, you ask them, who else should I be talking to? And from there, your sampling actually snowballs to help you recruit the most knowledgeable people for your study. Stratified sampling is a different type of sampling that really allows you to differentiate your findings by group. So you may want to stratify by age, race or ethnicity, or other key criteria that are relevant to your study, which is similar to criterion sampling, where you have very set criteria in terms of who would be included in your study population. And lastly, convenient sampling. This is really the type of sampling where you don't have a lot of opportunities to be very thoughtful. And so often you may just target the easiest to reach study sample. And so this is really discouraged in sampling. For those of you who are trying to figure out what type of sampling to do, we would really encourage you to be as purposeful as possible.
So now you've collected your data, what do you do now? You might be asking yourself that question. The consideration is that in qualitative analysis, it's really this balancing act of answering the research question that you have, consider the type and quality of the data collection strategies that you use, and how you want to ultimately present those findings really tie into the strategies that you're using for your data analysis. So the first thing to consider for qualitative data analysis is, what is your research question? We'll be going back to basics. What is the conceptual framework that guides your study? How is this going to enhance the analysis process that you'll be using in the future? The research question itself provides clues as to how you might approach your data analysis process, and the conceptual framework is a framing or something that you can hang the analysis on, either as a starting point or as an end point, and really help guide the data analysis process. The second thing to consider is, how did you collect your data? Was it structured, semi-structured, or unstructured? Janine talked earlier about different ways where data collection strategies might be structured, such as surveys, and that means asking the same question the same way, in the same order to all participants. But you might have semi-structured data collection strategies that might be interviews or focus groups or observations where you are not so rigidly following your script in your instrument, but you're essentially asking the questions ultimately of the same people. And you might have an unstructured data collection instrument, which whatever the participant talks about, that's the direction that the conversation goes to, for example. The third question you might ask yourself is, what is your analytic reasoning approach? Are you basing the analytic process on the participant's words? And if so, that's an inductive approach. Or are you starting with literature or theory that's already been developed, and you'll be using that primarily as your analytic reasoning approach, and that's a deductive approach. Inductive is developing codes derived from the participants' words themselves, and then deductive is when the codes are derived from other works, such as theories, conceptual frameworks, or other prior projects you might have had. And then ultimately, how do you want to present your data and your findings? If it's in themes or thematic statements derived from data, or are you going to be quantifying your findings in some sort of frequencies? So if you're doing a thematic analysis process, you'll ultimately be developing statements maybe showing diagrams of relationships and processes, but you're not counting how often somebody says something. What we're doing here is showing the relationship itself, and there's usually no frequency counts of either number of statements or number of people who said that statement. Conversely, content analysis is a process through which where you can do frequency counts of how often codes may come up for participants, and this is a way to do the quasi-statistics as mentioned earlier. Here we have a qualitative analysis timeline, and you've completed your data collection so far. There will be a set of data management principles that you have to go through, for example, cleaning up data, either if it's in survey form or in transcript form. There's a matter of checking the quality of the transcripts and the data that you have. Next is the coding process, and this is where you decide, is it inductive or deductive or a combination? And in terms of your outputs, what makes most sense for your research question? Are you wanting themes, quotes from individuals, or frequencies about concepts, or both? How you design your code book will ultimately depend on how you answer these questions. Now, through the coding process, you may have started using a team member or your research team to address threats to validity in terms of the analytic approach or the code application process. And so you might have to go multiple times and go through an iterative process to develop your final code book. Next, you'll start the analysis process, and this again might be with yourself or with team members, again to ensure the credibility of your findings. And this might be iterative in itself. And you might find that there's new ideas and new concepts that come up that weren't present when you were thinking about your project initially. So you might go back to the coding process itself again and iterate that process itself. You might also find that you need more data. So you might have to go through and start the data collection process again, either with new participants, or at this point you might go back to the participants and do a validation check with them. And then after that, you have a write-up phase, either a report out or a manuscript out to a journal.
Great. So now you have all of this data. You have a sense of what your timeline should look like. Are you feeling overwhelmed? Hopefully not, because basically just having a roadmap of where to begin will help you get started. So some key steps are first to transcribe and translate, if necessary, your data. Clean and de-identify any data as appropriate. And Sylvia alluded to both of these things earlier, in that you can't just take your raw data or your raw transcriptions and assume they're ready. You have to really be thoughtful in making sure that you've adjusted the data to make sure that there aren't any grammatical errors that could actually impact the analysis, or that you have any information that could jeopardize the confidentiality of your study participants.
Another major consideration for cleaning data is potentially missing the word not, right? So you might actually be analyzing something that's positive when it was meant to be negative, or vice versa.
And it changes the context.
Absolutely.
So we really encourage everybody to do a real thorough read-through of their transcripts after they've been transcribed, because oftentimes people don't transcribe their data themselves. They'll send it off to a company to do the transcriptions. Sometimes those companies are not always in the U.S.
Or knowledgeable about your topic.
Exactly. And then finally, you want to input this clean data into some type of a software. Some examples of software could be In Vivo or Deduce. And what this software really does is help you organize and categorize your data in a way that allows and facilitates the analysis, but what it doesn't do is do the analysis for you. It may look for some relationships and help you identify some things in that area, but it doesn't do the thinking behind the analysis. All has to be you. So some resources that you may need: you should identify and mobilize a team of coders that we've mentioned, because the more perspectives and individuals that you can involve really increase the credibility of your findings. You may want to have some specific content expert ready to participate. And getting back to that idea of participant validation, you might want to leverage some of those expertise as well. And so having all of these things clearly outlined in an analysis plan and timeline will really help you get started with the process. So coding. Bringing some order from the disorder. And that's really the objective of coding overall, is taking all of that data that you have, whether you have multiple sources of data or you have multiple time points from which data were collected or different types of data, you need to bring it all together.
How do we do that, Janine?
How do we do that? That's a great question. And the software is a great way to do that. It brings order to disorder because it allows you to group the data together. The coding process overall will really help you create piles of data. And so really think about this as the first step in the analysis process, is you are putting all of your data, whether it's audio or written transcripts or observation field notes, you are putting that all into the correct bucket. So you're going to have several different codes that emerge from your data, and it's from there that you'll develop the themes. So again, this is really the first step. And when you get onto the process of theme analysis, what you're going to do is you're going to pull one of these piles. So you're going to pull pile 5 and really look to see what's happening, what's really happening, what are people and the data telling us. So overall, thematic analysis is really your process of determining the meaning of the data, identifying the so what of the data and the research question, and it's much deeper than the coding alone. So thematic analysis can also help us see relationships between different themes. So while you may end up with maybe 10 or 15 different themes, there could be maybe 2-3 themes that actually have a relationship. Here in this visual, theme 1 kind of stands alone, while theme 2 and 3 have a very recognizable relationship. Part of the theme analysis is really going beyond labeling and identifying those themes to seeing relationships across them. This could be described in processes or just in terms of how things function and relate to one another. In summary, qualitative research is a great way to really explore and answer the research questions in a way that you couldn't do with just quantitative methods, especially when they pertain to really wanting to understand the why, the how, the processes, and those relationships that we talked about. Qualitative research can really be systematic in terms of the data collection and analysis. So even though there's no one size fits all type approach, you should really still try to challenge yourself to be systematic in terms of how you approach the data collection and analysis to maintain as much rigor throughout the process. Thank you so much for listening to our Introduction to Qualitative Methods. As you may have noticed, this is just a basic introduction. We can go into each of these topics in depth, and we plan to do so at another point, so keep a lookout for subsequent presentations.
Thank you.